My latest work is actually on democratization, revolution, and authoritarianism in North Africa, and it is basically looking at the political developments in North Africa during and after the Arab uprisings of 2011, and what this meant and what this means today for Islamist movements and Islamist parties. And so the topic of the lecture today is precisely to look at what do the Arab uprisings and the consequences of the Arab uprisings in 2011 tell us about the contemporary articulations between democracy, democratic practices, electoral democracies on the one hand in the Middle East and North Africa, and Islamist movement, Islamist politics, and Islamist ideology in relation to this development. So in this talk, I will first of all consider the general parameters of Islamist politics in the region before the Arab uprisings, that is to say, under authoritarian rule. Not that authoritarian rule has completely disappeared from the region today, but at least there are some exceptions. So the situation of Islamist movements and parties before the 2011 Arab uprisings, then their recomposition, reorientation, rearticulation during and after the 2011 Arab uprisings, and what this means, what kind of possibilities, what kind of options for democratic politics this indicates for the region today. And I will finish off my presentation by considering in more detail the case of Tunisia. Tunisia, which is commonly presented as the one successful case of democratic transition of the Arab uprisings, and so I will look at the case of Ennahda, which is the leading Islamist party in Tunisia, and the reasons of the success, the relative success, because in this case everything is relative, of course, the relative success of the Tunisian democratic transition and what this means for other transition, for other Islamist parties in the region, which have not been as successful as Ennahda in Tunisia. So, let me begin with some general points about Islamist politics and the question of democracy, with, of course, some common misrepresentation of Islamist politics, of Islamist movements, and of the very idea of democracy. And this is, of course, informed, as you probably know already, by various Orientalist interpretation of Islam and Islamism, which assume that, in principle, there is a fundamental opposition between Islamic principle, the Islamic doctrine, and Islamist politics, and the notion of liberal democracy and the notion of electoral democracy. Very often, this is framed as a kind of principled opposition between, on the one hand, the sovereignty of God, which would imply that if God is sovereign, then the people are not. And so if you are advocating any kind of Islamic state or Muslim democracy, that implies that Islam is the primary principle of governance, that implies that God is the sovereign. Therefore, you cannot have a fully democratic system where the people are sovereign. So you have this principal opposition between the sovereignty of God versus the sovereignty of the people. And this Orientalist interpretation, this kind of essential position between an Islamic approach to politics and a democratic approach to politics were kind of prevalent in the 60s, 70s, definitely, when Islamist parties were emerging and voicing their political claim initially. But over time, this debate has evolved quite substantially, and nowadays you will find that most mainstream Islamist parties will argue that there is no fundamental opposition between democracy and Islamic principles, between the sovereignty of God and the sovereignty of the people, because at the end of the day, Islamic doctrine is interpreted by the people. The word of God is transmitted through the people. The will of God is embodied in the action of the people. Therefore, it is perfectly acceptable and meaningful to have an Islamic system that is grounded, as any democracy, on the sovereignty of the people, as Muslims, therefore, are expressions of God's will. So the debate has evolved over time between this notion of a fundamental opposition between Islamist ideology and governance and democratic ideas and governance to a middle ground position whereby most mainstream mass-based Islamist party would say that an electoral democracy is a perfectly acceptable political system for an Islamic party, and Islamist party will be most willing to play by the rule of electoral democracy. And I'll talk a bit more about Grenada at the end to illustrate some of these dynamics. There are, of course, some Islamist movements, especially among the most ultra-conservative Islamist movements, Salafi-oriented Islamist movement, that will argue that there is still a fundamental opposition. That if you are a truly Islamic movement, you cannot be a democratic movement at the same time. So let me not lead you into thinking that there is a general consensus among Islamist movements and organizations. There are clearly some organizations today that still think that there is a fundamental opposition. But they tend not to be the largest organizations. And it is important as well not to create a fundamental construction of Islamism as a form of political activism that is necessary to the politics of the Muslim world as well, in the sense that Islam is as important to people in political terms as people want it to be or make it to be. It is not because people are Muslim that they will necessarily endorse the agenda, the program, or the idea of an Islamist party. So the political relevance of Islam in all the countries of the Middle East and North Africa and elsewhere in the Muslim world is far more contextual than perhaps one might think. The fact that you are the Muslim majority countries does not necessarily make Islamist politics the leading form of politics in that particular country. Islamism is important insofar as Islamist movement and Islamist party are able to convince the population, the voters, that this is the right thing for them. And therefore, the importance of Islamist politics and Islamist parties will unsurprisingly change over time and from country to country depending on the historical circumstances, the political circumstances, the social context, and the geostrategic calculations of the various international actors involved in that particular country. So there is nothing determining about the form that Islamist politics will take and the importance that Islamist party will have in any country of the Middle East or North Africa or anywhere else around the Muslim world. Everything is pretty much contextual. Okay, so to say a bit more about these contextual factors in the context of the Middle East and North Africa before the Arab uprisings, before 2011. Clearly, the issue of democratization in the region was influenced and shaped by Islamist parties, but in several ways, and not always very directly. So clearly there were direct challenges by Islamist party in different states of the region, where Islamist party were trying to gain power, either violently by taking over the state, or legally by competing in elections whenever they had the opportunity. And their actions directly shaped the possibility of democratization in these different countries. But these direct challenges by Islamist party were often not the main obstacle to democratization in these countries, in the sense that very often the authoritarian regimes in place themselves created obstacles to democratization as a mean to prevent Islamist parties from gaining power. And in trying to suppress these Islamist parties, they generally tended to suppress all form of opposition in the country in order to strengthen their power. So there is a lot of debates and literature and examples on the fact that those authoritarian leaders who claim to be saving democracy from Islamism in their country are in fact hardly saving democracy at all, but entrenching their own personal power, and the Islamist challenge is very often used as the main excuse for remaining in power. I suspect that the latest example of that, clear example of that, will be the kind of the military coup by General Sisi in Egypt in 2013, when the Egyptian military intervened to take over from the elected government of the Muslim Brotherhood in order to save Egypt. And as we can all see today, it's Egyptian politics are hardly democratic under the rule of Sisi. And also the democratization dilemmas of most of the Middle East and North Africa have been shaped very much since 2001, since 9/11 and the Al-Qaeda attacks in the United States, by the interest and strategies of international actors being interested in implementing various securitizations policies in the region in order to contain the threat posed by transnational jihadi networks, with the latest example of that, of course, being the various policies of the US, Russia, and others in the Syrian conflict to fight ISIS. And generally speaking, this international involvement in the region against transnational jihadi network has meant, most of the time, stabilizing existing authoritarian regimes in the name of global security. So democratization opportunities in various countries especially before the Arab uprising, but also after the Arab uprising, have been directly shaped by this international involvement in various guises, but generally in favor of the incumbent authoritarian regime. I think this is kind of well captured in the quote here that I put by Saladin Ibrahimi, Egyptian scholars, and he was talking in the 2000s where Al-Qaeda instead of ISIS was the main threat and bin Laden was still alive and well, saying that when regional autocrats in the Middle East and North Africa say that the choice for international actors is either to support them or to support a very violent and radical brand of Islamism, then systematically foreign policymakers will support secular autocrats. And these perceptions have, of course, shaped the opportunities that Islamist movements have had in the region to get involved into processes of democratization. What this has produced throughout the region before the 2011 Arab uprising, and to a large extent still today, are facades of democracy, whereby various regimes in the region will introduce some small-ish democratic reforms to ensure that they appear to be democratic, namely that they organize election, that there is a multi-party system, that there is a parliament, and so on and so forth, so that they can claim that they are actually democratizing. And by co-opting various political actors in this facade democracy, they are able to keep up the pretense of democratizing authoritarian regimes. And this co-optation of various political actors includes also Islamist movement, Islamist political parties. I think I've put here, not sure if you can see it very well, a picture of the Algerian parliament. Algeria is a good example of that, where you still have a military-backed government which is organizing elections regularly, but elections which can hardly be described as free and fair. And in this controlled multi-party system, you do have Islamist party, you have secular party, you have regionalist parties, but by and large, the electoral system is controlled by the main state's party, or the pro-regime's party. And these authoritarian regimes are able to maintain a democratic facade through using a variety of means, including the three that I listed here, which are some of the kind of most common and most effective ones, namely an institutional bias in the selection of candidates, meaning that those opposition candidates, especially Islamists, who are likely to be a serious challenger for the state candidates or for the official pro-regime party, are disqualified on various grounds. Of course, a very important control of the mediosphere, giving a head start to the pro-regime candidates and parties, and repressing the discourse of the opposition and the ability of opposition actors to voice their claim. And if this is not sufficient, of course, there will kind of be traditional practices of stuffing the ballot box with the proper ballots, namely in favor of the pro-regime candidate. Not incidentally, practices which are specific to the Middle East and North Africa. Indeed, if you look at the Russian context today, there will be Russian election next week. This is pretty much the same set of practices that we see happening in Russia today. And these are kind of traditional practices that authoritarian regimes throughout the Middle East and North Africa have been using before the Arab Uprising, and many are still using today to remain in power. Very briefly, I want to touch upon the case of Morocco as an interesting illustration of controlled multipartyism in the region, but a rather sophisticated form of multipartyism. And you can see the sophistication of this model simply looking at the distribution of seats in the Moroccan parliament, that is before and after the Arab Uprising. And I suspect, I'm not sure if you see it very well on the charts that I put on the presentation, but the main point that I wanted to emphasize is that the Moroccan parliament is very divided into many different factions, with the largest one being the Islamist, the blue dots here on the right-hand side, no, sorry, left-hand side for you, the Justice and Development Party in Morocco, confusingly same name as the Turkish Justice and Development Party, but completely unrelated. And Morocco is an interesting case of facet democracy in the sense that Morocco is a constitutional monarchy in principle, but de facto a ruling monarchy where both in political terms and in religious terms, the king is the final decision maker. So nothing happens in Morocco in political terms, in terms of significant legislative process, laws, and policy decisions, or in terms of religious decrees and orientations without the king agreeing to it. So it is still an authoritarian system in the sense that the king of Morocco is not the queen of England, and the king of Morocco actually does rule directly. And the government, the elected Moroccan government and the parliament have to deal with that. But it is nonetheless a rather sophisticated authoritarian system and facet democracy in the sense that usually elections in Morocco are reasonably free and fair, so that people are elected in parliament in a fairly functioning electoral democracy. However, elected politicians, the elected government in Morocco is hardly ever able to challenge the king of Morocco because the electoral system in Morocco is designed in such a way that it is quasi-impossible for any party to have any kind of majority in parliament, or even for two parties to have any kind of majority in parliament. So the electoral system is designed in such a way so as to fragment the electoral constituency and the vote. So that Islamist parties, even though they are the largest party in the parliament, even though they may head the government, are forced into coalition politics with other political parties that do not share at all their Islamic agenda. Which means that even though they may do well in elections, Islamist parties in Morocco are not able to put forward a very Islamist agenda, religious reform and so on and so forth, because they have necessarily to engage in coalition politics, make deals with other political parties, non-Islamic political parties, And this means that at the end of the day, it's the kind of lowest common denominator that ended up being the policy of the government, something that satisfies as many people in the ruling coalition as possible, and that has very little ideological orientation. And similarly, these coalition governments are never in a position to challenge the authority of the king because they are fragile coalition each time. So in Morocco, you have a rather complex system of pseudo-democratic electoral and institutional arrangements that dilute the weight that Islamist party could have in the political system if the political system was designed in a much kind of fairer way. Now, moving on to the Arab uprisings, some of the people that I've mentioned already or that I will be talking about briefly. I'm not sure if you can read all the names. So you have basically the king of Morocco, top left, then the president of Algeria, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, top in the middle, two of the authoritarian leaders still in charge today in Morocco and in Algeria. Then top right, you have the departed authoritarian leader, President Ben Ali of Tunisia, who is now living in exile in Saudi Arabia. Bottom left, Colonel Gaddafi, who is now dead and buried, from Libya. And finally, Hosni Mubarak, former president of Egypt, used to be in jail, now got a free out of jail card and is not no longer in jail. So some different fate for the different authoritarian leaders that were in control in these North African countries before the Arab uprisings, and which point to different trajectories of democratization after the Arab uprising. And these different trajectories of democratization could be portrayed in two different ways in relation to Islamism and the role of Islamist politics. First, as I mentioned at the beginning, you could see some of these trajectories of democratization as an illustration of the substantive differences between Islamic form of democracy and liberal forms of democracy. And you could say that some of the successes and failures of democratic transition after the Arab uprising are the result of this principal, fundamental opposition between different models of governance, some Islamic, some democratic. And when the two cannot work together, then necessarily the democratic transition fails. And when the two are able to work together, then there is a chance of success. I think that the main point I want to make is that it is probably not very helpful to look at this tension, at this interaction from a substantive perspective. Namely, it is not by looking at the principle of liberal democracy and the principle of an Islamic political order that you can understand why specific countries successfully go through a process of democratic transition, whereas other countries fail. And this is not to say that there are not important ideological differences between the two. There are if you look at the principle, at the main ideas, there are clear differences between, for example, a liberal approach to the right of the individual and the rights of the community. And in the liberal tradition, usually rights will be primarily attributed to individuals, the primacy of human rights, whereas the community, the group, will not tend to be the subject of specific rights, or less important rights than the individual. If you look at it from an Islamic perspective, in the Islamic tradition, the community may have more rights in some instances than the individual. So there are different prioritization of rights in different contexts. The same if you look at, for example, the boundary between what is the public sphere and what is the private sphere. Whereas in the liberal Western tradition, the private sphere tends to be quite important and well delimited from the public sphere. In an Islamic tradition, this boundary may not be placed at the same place. And what is public may actually be more important, and then what is private may actually be smaller than in the liberal tradition. So again, a different set of prioritization. So there are substantive differences here. But the point that I'm making is that looking at the trajectories of these different countries after the Arab uprising, it does not seem to be the case that it is these substantive clashes between ideas that made or unmade specific transition. And this is because these substantive dilemmas can be reinterpreted, and usually are reinterpreted, into more concrete political choices and strategy. And people, in fact, at the end of the day, agree or disagree on specific political choices, specific political positions, specific political strategies, what specific political parties do and don't do, rather than on grand ideas. And an illustration of that would be looking at the evolution of politics in Egypt and in Tunisia after the 2011 elections, the first relatively free and fair elections in these countries after the Arab uprising. Elections which in each case, in Egypt and in Tunisia, enable an Islamist party to have the largest share of votes and the largest share of seats in the parliament. So in the case of the Egyptian parliament, that would be the Muslim Brotherhood Party, which was then called the Freedom and Justice Party, but it's basically an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in the case of Tunisia, that would be the Ennahda party. However, the choices and strategies that these two Islamist parties, which had initially a fairly similar ideological position and agenda, it's not miles away between what the Muslim Brotherhood was advocating in terms of Islamic reform and Islamic approach to governance, and what Ennahda was advocating in terms of Islamic interpretation of governance. So initially, these two political parties had fairly similar set of principles and approaches, but they did politics in very different ways. In the case of Ennahda in Tunisia, the Islamists decided to form a coalition government with two pro-secular parties from the left and liberal political parties, so that they created a ruling coalition by actively seeking the support of non-Islamist parties, liberal and leftist political party. And by developing policies and positions that have the support of these secular political parties. The Muslim Brotherhood, on the other hand, went the other way, and they decided to try to push forward their own political agenda without paying much attention to what the secular political parties were demanding in Egypt. And in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood mostly dealt with the Salafists of the Noor party, which was, in the Egyptian case, the second largest party in the parliament. So rather than making alliances with secular party, the Muslim Brotherhood tried to find an agreement with the Salafi parties in the Egyptian parliament and ignore the demands of the secular parties. And at the end of the day, in the Egyptian case, the military intervened to kick the Brotherhood out of power with the support of the secular political parties, and, maybe more surprising, with the support of the Salafi of the Noor party as well. Indicating perhaps an important general point about Islamist politics in the region and more generally, namely that it is not because Islamist parties are Islamist that they are natural political allies. It may well be that, in fact, one Islamist party would support, as in the case of Egypt, a military coup against another Islamist party. And there is often an oversimplification here of Islamist politics. People assuming that because political parties have an Islamist orientation, they are naturally going to work together. It may be so, but it is not necessarily so. So in that case, there is a political logic here that may supersede the religious logic of their engagement. It may well be that they both share some general Islamic principle and agenda and ideas, but in practice, they will try to score political points, the one against the other. And in the case of Ennahda in Tunisia, the leadership of Ennahda clearly decided that it made more sense for them to build bridges with secular political parties and to try to appeal to the more moderate conservative vote in Tunisia, rather than to focus primarily on the Islamic activists and on the Islamic vote, and people voting primarily on the basis of Islam as their main concern. And this not only was illustrated in the kind of alliances that they made with secular political parties, but also by the fact that Ennahda took their distance with the Salafi movements, which were quite important in Tunisia as well after the revolution. And Ennahda, the Ennahda government will end up classifying the main Salafi movement of Tunisia, Ansar al-Sharia, a terrorist organization, in 2013 after having taken their distance from the Salafi movement. So there is political competition in this context, and there is religious competition happening at the same time. And it is important to be able to distinguish what Islamist movement and parties are doing that is informed by political competition, and what it is that they are doing that is informed by religious competition. And the two are not the same. They are trying basically they have to play on two scoreboards at the same time. They have to play the formal political game as political party, and they have to play the religious game as religious movements. And this creates tensions at times. And you have to see the strategy, the actions of this Islamist party in relation to these two sets of concerns that they have at the same place at the same time. And of course, the outcomes of these choices can be surprising for many people on the ground, in the sense that you've got a couple of pictures here from Egypt and Tunisia. Again, one photo shot a portrait of Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president, and Mubarak, indicating that wanted to illustrate the continuities in authoritarianism between the former authoritarian leadership of Mubarak and that of Morsi. And on the other picture, a placard from Tunisia saying nothing has changed, again directed at Grenada, pointing to the continuities between the authoritarian period and the post-Arab uprising period. Islamist politics at the end of the day may not be very different from politics as we know it, in the sense that one of the slogans of this party may well be Islam is the solution, but at the end of the day, during democratization processes, this Islamist party may behave pretty much as any other political party would behave during a period of democratic transition. The kind of policy that they implement, the kind of choice that they make, the kind of mistake that they make, may tell us very little about the Islamic character of these parties. Okay, I realize I'm kind of slightly running out of time. I wanted, therefore, to turn to, sorry, one slide. Right. To turn to the case of Tunisia for my last set of illustration. In the case of the Tunisian transition to democracy, part of the success of the Tunisian case is clearly linked to Ennahda, to the Ennahda party, the main Islamist party in Tunisia, and to the ability of the Ennahda party to stabilize, to become a stabilizing force in Tunisian politics by avoiding the kind of polarization between secularists and Islamists that we have seen in Egypt, that we have seen in Libya as well, that we've seen in Syria and elsewhere in the region. And the success of the Ennahda party in doing that is connected directly to a large extent to the role of Rashid Ghannouchi, who is the leader of the Ennahda party, has been the leader for many, many decades now, lived in exile, nearly 20 years in exile in London, whilst Ben Ali was in head of state in Tunisia and repressing the organization. And the interesting point about Ghannouchi, I guess, is that during these years in exile, as I guess illustrated by the subtitle of the book on Ghannouchi, slightly over the top book, but never mind, a Democrat within Islamism. Ghannouchi has been instrumental in developing the notion that an Islamist agenda can be fairly well implemented within a democratic political system, within a liberal democratic political system, within a secularized political system, and there is not only no necessary opposition between Islamic principles and liberal democratic principles, but that Islamic principle can benefit from a liberal democratic political framework. And so during these years in exile, the kind of religious positions and political theory that it has developed and that has become the kind of the main ideology of the Ennahda movement has been quite important in facilitating the political action of Ennahda. Probably more, for example, than other organizations such as the Muslim Brotherhood, who did not develop to the same extent how they will engage directly with liberal democratic politics and had to invent some position and rules once they were in power. In the case of Ennahda, the fact that you had this kind of religious leadership and political leadership of Rashid Ghanouchi, that really helped the movement to position itself in relation to other political actors and to position itself in the religious sphere as being at the same time an Islamic movement and a democratic movement. So that's the flag of the Ennahda party during a political rally in Tunisia. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Islamist parties are always playing on two registers at the same time, the political one and the religious one. And there are tension, there are bound to be tension between political calculations and religious calculation, between what makes sense politically and what makes sense religiously. I'm making a very sharp distinction, of course, it's never so clear-cut, but I want to emphasize this kind of tension. In Tunisia, the political game was precisely in trying to find some common grounds with secular political parties to ensure that the different political forces in the country could work together, agree, for example, on a new constitution, on new electoral rules, and so on and so forth. And in that political perspective, the Ennahda party made some significant concession in terms of how far religion and Islamic principle should feature prominently in Tunisian politics, in the Tunisian constitution. For example, initially the position of Ennahda was that the Sharia, Islamic law, should feature prominently in the Tunisian constitution as one of the basic principles of governance in Tunisia and one of the basic principles of the Tunisian state. At the end of the day, there was no mention of the Sharia in the Tunisian constitution. So, for political reasons, to stabilize the situation in Tunisia, the Ennahda party made some notable concessions. And these made sense in terms of stabilizing the democratic transition in Tunisia, making Ennahda a legitimate political party which could stay in power, which could govern the country, which could participate in routine politics. And this is one of the reasons why the democratic transition in Tunisia is today one of the most successful, if not the only successful democratic transition in the region after the Arab Uprising. Now, this political success of Ennahda in Tunisia came at some religious costs. It had a religious cost in the sense that by doing so, Ennahda lost some of its religious credentials, and surprisingly. It lost some of its religious authority and legitimacy vis-à-vis some of the more hardline conservative religious groups, such as the Salafi, which is unsurprising in the sense that Salafi organization, of course, would want a much more Islamic framework of governance, and would only make minimal concession to electoral democracy, liberalism, and so on and so forth. But Ennahda also lost some of its appeal to its grassroots membership, who also wanted more religious input, more Islamic input, in the sense that by aiming for the kind of moderate conservative voter, this kind of liberal Ennahda policy alienated some of their more activist religious supporters. So there were concessions here, that there were some costs, if you wish, some religious costs to the political success of Ennahda in Tunisia. And this is, I suspect, the last point I want to make. Oops, yeah, come back. No, not coming back. Okay, I'm not sure how to make it bigger. Okay, so thank you. In the case of the post-uprising situation in the Middle East and North Africa, in the context of what this means for Islamist politics, I think it is important to make a distinction between a successful democratic transition to electoral democracy, as we have in Tunisia, and the success of a new form of Muslim politics. Two different notions here. Clearly, Tunisia appears to be a case of successful electoral democracy. Certainly by regional standard, considering that most of the other cases have failed, it is a success. And this working electoral democracy, working in political terms, is not the same as a Muslim democracy. That is to say, a system of governance which includes at the same time liberal democratic principles and Islamic principles, and that finds some kind of synergy between Islamic values, Islamic norms, Islamic principles, and liberal norms, liberal principles, liberal values, laws, and so on and so forth. And this is the elusive quest at present in the region and in Islamic thinking, modernist Islamist thinking. Can you actually devise a system of governance that is able to make room for these two sets of values without making it a zero-sum game? Without making it necessarily a compromise. If you want to include some Islamic values, then necessarily you have to take out of the equation some liberal values, which is usually the way in which the debate is framed. If you want to make room for more religious issues, principles, you have to scale down the liberal democratic values and principles. Can there be a way of making the two coexist without not in a zero-sum game equation, to be able to include these Islamic views, and to include them for very good reason, because they are the views shared by a large number of people on the ground. Even if you go to Tunisia today, there are a lot of very conservative religious people who want more Islam in the state. Somehow, in a representative democratic system, you have to be able to include the views of these people. You have to include these people in the political system, because if you don't include them in the political system, they may just, leave the political system and join Islamic organization, which may be far more radical. Tunisia, it is well known, has been one of the main source of jihadi fighters in Syria for many years now. So, you have some religious constituency, some conservative religious constituencies in Tunisia as elsewhere in the region, and you have somehow to address some of their needs, some of their demands, better than by simply excluding them from politics because they are not liberal democratic enough. So the elusive quest now is beyond electoral democracy, beyond the fact of having Islamist party regularly involved in elections in a multi-party political system. Can there be some system of governance that is able to create a synergy between liberal and Islamic values? The Tunisian case at present is mainly a case of the success of electoral democracy, not an example of Muslim democracy that could be duplicated elsewhere in the region. Because in religious terms, it does not tell us very much about how to include Islamic principle ideas in a working democratic system. It can tell us how to include an Islamist political party in a democratic political system, but not a whole gamut of ideas, values, and so on and so forth. So it may well be that over time there will be such a debate, there will be such experiment happening in Tunisia, but at present this is not the case. So what the Tunisian success tells us today is mainly about the kind of political tactics, the kind of political alliances that Islamist party should be making in order to become part of a working multi-party democratic political system. It does not tell us very much about a genuine Muslim democracy, what it would look like, and how to make this work. I guess I gave the example of the Tunisian constitution here just to illustrate that that the Tunisian constitution, the new Tunisian constitution that was voted when Ennahda was the leading party in Tunisia, does not say very much about Islam. So in terms of creating a Muslim democracy that includes Islam without excluding liberal democratic principle, so far not much new under the sun. And I suspect that will be the challenge in Tunisia and in the rest of the region moving forward. I mean, not only to think about democratization in terms of having a functioning electoral democracy, and to be fair, that is an important first step, and that would be nice to have working electoral democracy throughout the Middle East and North Africa. But beyond that, when we are thinking about Islamist politics, the question is about, well, how do you include, how do you deepen the liberal democratic approaches to governance by including Islamic views and principles? Not by making liberal democracy weaker, but in a way that makes liberal democracy a different kind of democracy, a Muslim democracy, but that can still work well for all the people involved. And on this rather positive but perhaps over-optimistic note, I guess I will end my presentation. Thank you.